I want you to just imagine something for a second. Right now, while we are talking about this, a nuclear-armed nation of 240 million people is actively navigating a potential serial default that has massive global implications. Today, we're going to investigate exactly how this cycle operates from the inside out.
Right now, literally as we speak, Pakistan's government is spending over $500,000. And get this, it's not on building roads or funding schools or constructing hospitals. That money is going purely to interest. It's just the carrying cost from money they already borrowed years ago. Last year, debt repayments swallowed almost 80% of everything the federal government collected in taxes. When 4/5 of your revenue vanishes into thin air before you can even begin to govern, you're not managing debt anymore. You're trapped by it.
So, that brings us to the big question we're tackling today. Why can't Pakistan just stop borrowing? I mean, since 1950, this country has gone to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency bailout 25 separate times. 25. And every single time, the promise is exactly the same. This is the reform that finally fixes the foundation. So today we have to ask, is the relatively calm economic surface we're seeing in 2026 actually different? Or is it just the quiet period before bailout number 26? To really understand this, we're going to conduct a structured autopsy of this whole economic machine. We'll look at the endless bailout loop, trace the historical roots of the borrowing habit, dissect the 3 broken gears driving it all, examine the debt service trap, evaluate today's temporary stabilization, and finally, deliver the final verdict. Okay, part 1, the endless bailout loop. This is the recurring cycle of crisis, bailout, and reform that has defined the economy for decades. So right now, in 2026, officials are pointing out that things have stabilized. They've got central bank foreign reserves sitting around $16 billion, which, hey, sounds like a massive victory, right? Well, until you realize there's $138 billion in total external debt and liabilities absolutely dwarfing it. It's a nice mattress to fall back on, sure, but it is definitely not a vault. And to maintain even that cushion, Pakistan isn't just running one IMF bailout right now, they're actually running 2 of them concurrently. There's the extended fund facility to stabilize the everyday budget and a totally separate resilience and sustainability facility meant just to protect against floods and climate disasters. Think about that. Right now, even the country's disaster insurance runs through Washington. Moving to part 2, the roots of the borrowing habit. To figure out how a nation gets to 25 bailouts, we really need to slow down and look at how this cycle actually began. Let's step back a bit. When Pakistan was created in 1947, it inherited almost no industrial base, a colonial tax system, and the immediate, super expensive reality of a larger neighbor right next door. From day one, the math just didn't work. Spending outran what the state could collect. So they borrowed. By 1958, they'd signed their very first IMF agreement. And from there, the script just repeats. Reserves drain, imports get entirely too expensive, a rescue loan is negotiated, taxes go up briefly, subsidies are cut, but then elections roll around, subsidies creep back in, and boom, the cycle resets. The underlying machine generating all this debt was never actually rebuilt. Part 3, the 3 broken gears. This is the core structural machine underneath the economy. There are 3 specific gears turning against Pakistan all at once: tax, energy, and trade. All right, gear 1 is the ridiculously narrow tax base. Get this, Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio is around 10%. That sits among the lowest of any major economy on Earth. For example, agriculture makes up roughly 24% of the whole economy, yet its effective tax contribution is a fraction of 1%. Huge chunks of income just sit completely outside the federal tax net. Basically, almost nobody pays tax the way a modern state actually needs them to. Then we have Gear 2, the bleeding power sector. It's perfectly captured by this phrase you might hear, circular debt. Basically, this sector loses money almost by design. The power distribution companies can't collect what they're owed, whether from technical losses or just unpaid bills. And because they can't collect, they can't pay the power generators. The generators then can't pay the fuel suppliers. And that shortfall doesn't just magically vanish, right? It gets parked as debt and rolled forward. At its peak, that unpaid pile in just the power sector hit over $9 billion. And Gear 3, the incredibly small export economy. Look at this wild comparison. There are about 9 million Pakistanis working abroad, and they send home close to $40 billion a year in remittances. But the domestic population of over 200 million people,
They export goods worth almost exactly the same amount, roughly 40 billion. The economy simply consumes more dollars than it earns from the rest of the world. So every single global shock hits their currency instantly because there's no deep well of export earnings to absorb the blow.
Part 4, the debt service trap. This is what happens when you combine those three broken gears. Borrowing stops being occasional, it becomes the only way the machine keeps running. So total public debt is around 70 to 80% of the economy. Honestly, that size isn't inherently unusual. India and Brazil carry similar, sometimes higher loads. But it's what that debt costs to carry that is the absolute killer here. India spends maybe 25 to 30% of its revenue on interest. Brazil sits around 20 to 25%. Pakistan? They spend roughly 50% of their federal revenue just on interest alone. Add in the principal payments, and the burden actually rivals Argentina, a country historically synonymous with serial default. The debt is overwhelmingly expensive because it's completely exposed to high interest rates and foreign currencies. The real-world impact of this is just staggering. Out of a 17 trillion rupee budget, nearly half goes straight to debt servicing. Think about that for a second. That is more than the entire defense budget. It is many times more than what is set aside for actual development projects that could grow the economy. Pakistan's #1 single largest government expense is literally just the interest on its past borrowing. Part 5, a temporary stabilization. Let's take a breath here and look at the contrast between the cautious hope we're seeing today and the underlying reality. We absolutely have to acknowledge that 2026 genuinely does not look like the terrifying crisis of 2022 and 2023. Back then, inflation was tearing past 30%, and default was a very real risk. Today, inflation is back in the single digits and growth has picked up. Even the IMF is praising the government's implementation. But it's fragile, really fragile. Just to help clear an IMF reserve target, China alone had to roll over $3.4 billion in loans. So this recovery, it honestly looks less like a permanent cure and a lot more like a patient hooked up to an IV drip. And meanwhile, the actual critical structural reforms needed to treat the disease instead of just the symptoms, they are totally stalled. Privatizing loss-making state companies, properly taxing agricultural income, fundamentally fixing that bleeding power sector, these deadlines just keep slipping. They get watered down the second they threaten politically connected interests. We're basically just treating the symptoms, not the underlying condition. Which brings us to part 6, the final verdict. Are we finally breaking the cycle, or are we just waiting around for bailout number 26? Here is the objective, undeniable reality. The country has absolutely mastered the art of clearing IMF targets just to unlock that next tranche of funding. They're great at it, but the structural habit of borrowing remains completely intact because, as it turns out, surviving alone is not the same thing as outgrowing your need for it. Underneath all those optimistic headlines of single-digit inflation and higher reserves, those three broken gears from earlier, they're still silently turning. The tax base is still incredibly narrow. The power sector is still structurally bleeding cash every day, and the export economy is still far too small for the massive population relying on it. That massive interest counter we started with, the machine producing that debt, is still plugged in and running. Until Pakistan changes who pays tax, how its power sector actually operates, and how much it earns from the global market rather than borrowing from it, the debt is inevitably going to keep coming back. Not because anyone wants it to, but because the cold, hard math demands it. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from this explainer. As we look at the relative calm of 2026, are we witnessing a genuine historic breakthrough, one that will finally end 3/4 of a century of economic looping? Or is this simply a quiet, comfortable little stretch before bailout number 26 hits? Only the structural reforms in the years ahead hold the real answer. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking the tough questions, and I'll see you in the next explanator.